species. They affect different species, and they're likely to increase as we get more wind turbines, but this just puts into perspective how big an issue the window collisions are. To give a bit of a snapshot, 1 year of monitoring in Ottawa had just under 5,000 collisions documented. And this is only the tip of the iceberg, even at the buildings we monitor. We estimate that we find about 5 to 15% of victims at monitored buildings. That worst building I mentioned in the last slide, I've actually watched a sapsucker hit it and get grabbed out of the air by a raven before it hit the ground. So if I hadn't happened to be there looking up and hearing a thump, I would have not documented that collision because there was nothing left, no evidence left for people coming by later. So our very conservative total in Ottawa is more than 250,000 a year. We have documentation. This is out of date now. It's 145 species. Our most recent species documented was a fatal collision of an American bittern, which you wouldn't expect to be a species that collides, and they don't collide a lot, but they certainly can. And we have 14 species at risk documented colliding as well. To give an idea of the diversity that we're talking about, we have a bit of a breakdown of the numbers here. A large percentage are warblers. I know we have a lot more warblers here in Eastern Canada or Ontario than on the West Coast, but that doesn't mean that there aren't warblers hitting out west as well. We have lots of sparrows, chickadees, thrushes, kinglets, and we also have some species that you wouldn't guess about either. We have in the middle right there is a wild turkey. They move around a lot and end up in weird places, especially in the fall and the spring as they're looking to find mates. And this is at the Bank of Canada, which is essentially across from Parliament Hill. And while these numbers are really striking, I want to talk a little bit more about a personal story that is more than just the numbers. So this is a red-tailed hawk nest that was at Carleton University, and they built it there during the pandemic when there were fewer students around to bother them. And we got a call because one of the parents hit the glass and died. And looking at the size and a few other things, we were able to figure out that this was the female. And this was not a good thing for these chicks. And we found out that we could actually access the nest by going up. It was actually the men's bathroom in that building. And going and leaning out the window, we could provide supplementary feeding. However, the story doesn't end there. Fairly soon after this happened, there was a very major rainstorm, and the smallest chick got soaked and died. And this is because mom wasn't there to brood him. The dad was around, but they don't brood the chicks. We did get 2 of them fledged though, which we were very excited about. There was a number of days of cutting up mice and getting them down their little throats. We were excited, and it paid off. And unfortunately, a couple days after they fledged, we got another call saying that one of the chicks had hit the library and died. And so this really shows that it's not just the birds that we find that are dead. It's also their offspring, essentially their mates. I think there's someone with a bit of background noise. Maybe you could mute yourself, please. Thank you very much. So this just gives like a bit of a personal and a perspective that's not just about numbers. It's about stories about birds and how 3 out of 5 of this nest were either directly or indirectly killed by collisions. Now, collisions in Victoria, a lot of the numbers and buildings I'm going to be talking about today are in Ottawa because I'm in Ottawa. But we do know something about collisions on the West Coast, so I'll try and include that as much as possible. There's definitely less monitoring happening on the West Coast. There was a study at the University of Victoria, some very good studies at UBC. Additionally, there's been some studies at the Pacific Wildlife Research Center near Rifle. They tested some treatments there. And there's also an ongoing study at Simon Fraser University. I think it is also harder to study on the West Coast because these studies have shown that probably similar numbers of birds are hitting, but they're not hitting in the same way because Victoria is known as a wintering spot for birds. And so a lot of places will get a couple birds a week over the entire year versus in Ottawa, we tend to get these really big surges of collisions at certain times of year in migration. And I think it just really makes people want to act more when they have a big number happening all at once. People may just say, oh, that's too bad if they get one collision a week every year, but if they get 50 plus birds in a flock hitting in one day, that's when they're going to take action. So that's a bit of a challenge on the West Coast. So this is one study that was done on the West Coast showing the vulnerability of varied thrush. And so this study looked at how many birds were found to have collided compared to their abundance in the area through point counts. And they found that varied thrush are really one of the species that collides the most compared to its abundance. So if you like varied thrush, treat your windows. These are the top species that each of these studies found. You can see that varied thrush features in both of them. We have fox sparrow, kinglets. Barn swallow was not in the top 5. It was the 6th, but as a species at risk, I thought it was worth including. And we can also see from the graph near the top there that there was a big push and fall, and that's probably when there's a lot of juveniles moving through, but there was collisions really all year round. Why are we having so many collisions? Well, this is because we're in love with glass and becoming more in love with glass every day. And you can see this in the design of buildings and how they've changed over time. More and more glass. Luckily, we seem to have moved away a bit from the one in the middle and the bottom there. The mirrored glass is maybe less common than it used to be, but there's still companies that are selling mirrored film that you can put up to have some privacy in your home. And that has the same effect. So we're seeing this at single-family houses, office buildings, multi-unit residential, everywhere is getting more glass. And people may wonder, they say, well, I never see any birds. It's not a problem here. Well, we found some really high scavenging rates. There's actually a graduate student at Carleton now working on this among many questions, basically leaving out carcasses and doing laps around to see how long they last. And in some cases, the answer is seconds to minutes. There's some very efficient scavengers out there, but there's also birds that, fall into vegetation, they move away. We know a lot of the custodians who are downtown in Ottawa, they sweep up the birds along with the leaves and the garbage and everything else. So there's lots of birds that hit and that don't get seen. And that really includes those that hit and then fly away to die elsewhere. And I will talk a little bit more about that towards the end. When birds hit, most of them die. And they don't die of broken necks for the most part. That's a common myth. They die of head trauma. They are basically running headfirst into a solid object at high speeds. They also can have very high internal bleeding. The ones that do survive, that 30%, often die later from their injuries or just because they're not able to take care of themselves. They're not able to feed. They're not able to get away from predators. And a new paper has actually come out recently showing that even a higher percentage than we thought of those that hit and fly away go on to die. And this is through looking at rates of mortality at rehab centers. I think with this crowd, I don't really need to spend a lot of time on this slide. Birds matter because we love them. But if people don't love them, there's also some economic and environmental reasons to appreciate them as well. There's one study that I found was really cool that basically exclosed an entire area of forest up in the boreal region. They basically put up fencing and netting around it to keep birds out. And then they looked at the growth and quality of the wood produced in there and found it was tremendously lower than those in the natural setting. So, anyone working in the forestry or industry, or who benefits from it, or who likes wooden furniture, you benefit from birds. And our birds are declining. Again, I'm sure I don't have to spend too long on this with this group. We know that birds are declining. Many of the species are, and even the common species are declining. Things like juncos, which is one of the species we see the most with collisions, it's declining. And of course, cats are a huge factor in this as well. But we actually find a lot of people who bring us birds that were caught by their cats say, oh, I think it hit my window first. And that's why it was on the ground and helpless. Let's move into why birds collide. Glass is basically an invisible hazard to them. And there's two main reasons they collide. It's either because the glass is transparent, and so they're basically trying to fly through it to get to the other side. They can also be fooled by reflection. So you can see in this picture, the trees that are reflected in the glass, and they think that these trees are real, and they try and fly towards them, and then they hit the glass. So what we do to treat windows can vary a little bit depending on why birds are hitting it, either transparency or reflections, but a lot of the treatments actually affect both. So a few examples of transparency. The top picture here shows a 3-story glass walkway. This is at the National Gallery in Ottawa. There are trees on either side, and it was littered with birds underneath during migration and during the summer, even in winter sometimes too. They have since treated this. We are very excited about that. This is an untreated glass walkway down below. It's a problem. There's you can't really see these trees, but they do have fruits on them, and so you get big flocks of waxwings going through. And that was actually how a safe wing started, is when a big flock of waxwings, I think Bohemian waxwings, hit at City Hall at a glass walkway in Ottawa. Glass railing panels are the bane of the existence of anyone who works with collisions. They are so common now, and they're just everywhere, even in places where it just boggles my mind that someone thought it was a good idea to put them there, like in this lovely marsh setting. And this is very common to see them, especially around green spaces, because people like to see their green spaces. And so they say, oh, I want something see-through so it doesn't impede my view. And that is lethal for birds. Indoor vegetation can be an issue. I think a lot of people would have a bit of trouble saying where the plants on the outside there stop and where the plants on the inside begin. And this can be an issue. There's a large movement towards having green walls, and often those green walls are surrounded in glass because they want people to be able to see their green wall and how environmentally friendly they are as the birds crash into the glass. We also have issues with transparency when we have corners on both sides, or sorry, glass on both sides of a corner. You can tell it's past my bedtime a bit here. And this is really common because birds are basically trying to take a shortcut and they don't think that anything is there. And while those are some of the more common ways that we see transparency being a problem, any glass in a bird's flight path can be a problem. This is from UVic, that's a bus shelter. And if anyone has been to Boundary Bay recently, you might recognize the glass fence down there. This was a news story where someone hit someone else with a hose. And I was not too interested in that, but I was very interested in the fact that there was a glass fence directly adjacent to an important bird area. This is a big problem. So moving on to reflectivity, as I mentioned, you have reflections of trees, sky, any extensions of habitat. So birds think it's real. And all glass, even glass that has low reflectivity, can be somewhat reflective in certain conditions. You can see in the bottom left there, you have both reflectivity in that you can see that tree reflected, but you also have transparency in that you can see through the corner to the other side. So glass can be both reflective and transparent, even though that kind of sounds like an oxymoron. Occasionally we get asked and we get told about these birds that people say they are crashing on purpose. And for the most part, that's not true. But especially in springtime when testosterone levels are high, we do see birds who are sort of crashing at lower speeds into glass and trying to attack what they see as another bird. And so this is a slightly different problem. I did see a paper that recently came out about this, showing that there are problems. They're not hitting as high speeds, but they are hurting themselves and they are spending a lot of energy trying to fight themselves. So covering these windows up even temporarily is a good way to deal with this in the short term. All right, so let's move on to what makes buildings lethal. So I'm sure if I pulled everyone in this room and I said, okay, which of these buildings kills more birds? Unless you were thinking about politics, you would probably guess the one on the right, and you would be correct. There's a lot of factors that I'll go through that make that one on the right especially lethal, but just to name a few, you have the presence of water nearby, you have lots of glass, you have lots of vegetation nearby, and it's highly reflective glass. Lots of we have a lot less glass, a lot less vegetation nearby, and while there is water nearby, it's not fresh water, which does, I think, probably make somewhat of a difference. So collisions by structure type, it is a very common misconception that high rises are the main issue. And while we do see more collisions per building at high rises, there are just so many more low rise and residential buildings that they make up for a lot more collisions. If we have, 100 skyscrapers and they have 100 collisions each, well, if you compare that to houses and you say, okay, well, they only have one each, well, there's thousands of them in a city. So it really adds up. And this is because of another conception or misconception. People think that birds are hitting as they migrate. So the skyscrapers are sticking up into the air and the birds are running into them as they migrate. And that is not true. It happens very rarely at night, and it makes the news a lot. But for the most part, the birds are hitting during the day, especially early morning, when they're trying to recover from their night of flying. So we very rarely see collisions above about 4 stories or 16 meters, unless there's also vegetation up there, for example, with a green roof. The amount of glass is a big issue. You can look at these 2 office buildings in downtown Ottawa, and I'm sure most of you could, or all of you could probably tell me which one is going to be worse. We have some very reflective glass in there, but we also have a lot of transparency in the one at the top, and especially transparency in the bottom one, where you can really see through all the way to the other side. Environmental context is huge. So even a single tree can make a difference. There's one building in Ottawa that's been very bad for collisions, and they cut down a bunch of the trees because the roots were growing into the parking garage below. And we've seen a huge decrease in the number of collisions there. And of course, the moral of the story is not cut down all the trees, but just that a single tree can make a lot of difference in terms of the number of collisions. However, just because there isn't a lot of green space doesn't mean that there aren't collisions. We have documented some very strange birds in downtown Ottawa colliding, things like whippoorwills, things like Sora, Virginia rail, things that you wouldn't expect to find in downtown Ottawa. And this is because they're drawn in by light pollution. So they get drawn in as they're migrating, they end up downtown, and then they try and leave in the morning when they realize that they're somewhere they don't want to be. And then they collide with the buildings then. So you can still have collisions even without trees. So design traps, these are a couple examples here. Courtyards tend to be a big problem. Basically, birds come in because there's trees, and then they're surrounded on 3 or even 4 sides by glass.
Mhm.
Similarly, anything that funnels birds towards a danger area, like this house down here, you're going to have birds trying to fly through to the other side through that glassed-in area in the middle. And of course, bird attractants. How do you have more birds? Well, you attract them through things like feeders, planting berry bushes or other sources of natural food, having bird baths. And the more birds in an area, the more collisions. And so it's especially important to treat your windows if you are drawing in birds to an area, because otherwise you're essentially making a bird trap. And that is really not what a lot of people who are trying to feed and help the birds are wanting. Now, I mentioned light, drawing in birds at night. It can affect birds in 2 different ways. When you have these spotlights, this is the memorial for 9/11 in New York, and all those little dots are birds, and they basically wheel around in there until they drop down, just exhausted, because they're drawn in by these very bright lights, strong bright lights, and they actually turn these off. They have monitors now, and once they reach a certain threshold of birds in the spotlights, they'll turn them off for a bit and they'll let them disperse. But the sort of city glow light is also an issue. That's more what we have in Ottawa, and that is something that draws birds in. We don't entirely know why, but it ends up with a lot of birds that you wouldn't expect to see in urban areas, in those urban areas where there's more danger. And so light pollution mitigation can be as simple as having a different type of light, one that really projects downwards exclusively. Things like having control with motion sensors and timers is really important. And even a single porch light makes a difference. I know a lot of people here in Ottawa, I don't know if it was visible in Victoria, were very excited by, seeing the Northern Lights, seeing the comet recently, and a lot of people were going out and getting really surprised by the amount of light pollution that meant that they couldn't see those very well. All right, so let's move on to how we prevent collision. These are all bird-friendly buildings, and they're a great example of bird-friendly buildings. They don't need to be these concrete bunkers with no windows. There's lots of ways to make buildings bird-friendly and still have great views and lots of light. You just have to be a bit creative and use these bird-friendly building materials. So here are some examples of glass that has patterns on it. Instead of having those glass balcony railings, having the metal ones also means that sometimes you can see better because they don't fog up or have algae grow on them, as is often the case in Victoria. And in the upper right, you can't really see those little dots there. This is a library in Ottawa, and it's a little reading room. And those dots are actually letters of the alphabet, and you can do a little word search in there if you're sitting there. And so I think that's an excellent creative way of making a building bird friendly while also being aesthetically pleasing and letting in a lot of light. So to be effective, a pattern needs to be dense. And so anything, whether it's dots or lines, needs to be spaced about 5 centimeters by 5 centimeters, needs to be on the exterior surface because if there's reflection, you can't see the interior surface, and it needs to be in a high contrast color. And this does seem very dense, but it's necessary because birds don't really understand that there's things in between the markers. They don't understand that there's glass in between the markers, sorry. And birds are used to flying between really small spaces like branches. And so having markers that work for people, like at this, I'm not actually even sure what that is. I know it's in Ottawa, but I think it's part of some sort of display. Anyways, but it has about 5 markers on it so that people don't walk into it. But birds are very happy to fly in spaces the size of the ones between there. So you need something more like the one on the right to prevent birds from colliding. And markers in one area don't prevent collisions elsewhere. So in addition to having the patterned glass, there's other ways, having integrated features. I think the one on the upper right there is at UBC, and they have basically a green outdoor wall, and that helps regulate temperature and also helps prevent bird collisions. But there's other methods, and some are even, I mean, I don't think the one in the bottom right with the slats there, I don't think that was the goal necessarily, but having those slots there really makes it less likely that the windows behind there will be hit. This is an example from the Newton Recreation Center, and this is in Surrey. And this is, I believe it's a vinyl film and lets in lots of light. It's kind of a bus wrap type film, so you can see out it a lot better than you can see in it. But it's a really great example of something that looks great, lets in light, and also prevents collisions. This is an example from Ottawa. They did a mid-year retrofit. They used patterned glass or opaque glass in the bottom. The brown social house that you can see that fencing around it has since installed plain glass panels, and we are working with them to try and say that this is really not what we want to have around a bird-friendly building. Unfortunately, so far they haven't moved on that, but the rest of the building is pretty great. And one of the ways we can make sure that we have more buildings that are good for birds is by having these bird-friendly design guidelines. Guidelines generally refer to ones that are not mandatory, whereas standards refer to ones that are mandatory. In Ottawa, we have guidelines. That's the most common, unfortunately, but also less effective. It's often done at the municipal level, but it would be much more ideal to include it in the provincial building code, and that would make it so that it is done across the province and equally with all buildings. There is some, the downtown core area plan in Victoria does include references to bird-friendly design. It is something that a couple of buildings, one that I'll mention in just a sec, have followed. It has not been followed for the most part, unfortunately. It's still pretty new though. And that is something that you can help with. It is, you know, having the 13 kingdoms of Greater Victoria does make it a challenge because they all have their own separate rules about this sort of thing. But we have seen both Sydney and Victoria have some form of bird-friendly design in their what was it? I always forget the name of it. Downtown core area plan for Victoria and design guidelines in Sydney, but the other municipalities have so far been resistant. So if you live or work or have connections in any of the other ones, please do spread the news. It's really great though having examples in Victoria because then we can share those with the other municipalities. So here's an example of what happens when guidelines aren't followed. And this is unfortunately something that's happening more than we would like. There's some growing pains here because a lot of architects kind of look at the guidelines and decide, okay, that's more or less what they want. And I'm going to kind of go off piste a bit. And this is what happened at the National Arts Centre. This is, again, very close to Parliament. And they put in patterned glass. They took essentially a stone wall and turned it into a glass wall. And they used patterned glass and said that it would be bird friendly. And they had an architect from Toronto where bird friendly design is mandatory, but they spaced the patterns very widely. All of the patterns were on the inside of the glass and they were in a low contrast color. And we have since recorded hundreds of collisions at this building, including species at risk. And something to note is that this is the same architectural firm as the Telus Ocean building going in Victoria. However, I'm hoping to have a bit of a a better ending to that story. This is one that was approved in Ottawa, and originally they were planning on having lots of reflective glass, transparent glass railings all around these roof gardens. I did quite a bit of outreach with them. I asked people to contact them. It made the news, and now they are planning on using ceramic frit pattern glass, and that's going to be really effective, I hope. It should be effective. We will see. It's often hard because they say, yes, we're going to do this. And then sometimes you wait a couple of years while there's construction, and then you find out, well, they didn't quite do what they said they were going to do. But this is very important because this is a building that is very close to a lot of green space near St. Anne's Academy and Beacon Hill. So I have high hopes for this one and look forward to checking it out. I'm not sure if it even is done. Maybe someone can tell me that after the talk. Anyway, so new buildings are really important because it's a lot cheaper to make buildings bird friendly at the start versus taking existing buildings and making them bird friendly. But it is very much possible both at a large and a small scale. If you're having collisions at your home, there's a few little quick fixes. These are not solutions in the long run, but they may help in the short term. Moving indoor plants away from windows. Sometimes closing your curtains or blinds can be helpful, and this is only the case if birds are seeing through to the other side. This was very common in the house I grew up in, and we ended up closing the blinds quite a bit for that reason. We didn't really understand, at the time, transparency reflection, but it did help quite a bit. Then something that seems a bit counterintuitive is placing bird feeders and bird baths less than 1 meter from windows. And this is because birds are often startled off of feeders by predators or something else. And if the feeder is very close to the window, if they hit the window, they're not going to be moving very quickly. And so they're less likely to have a fatal collision. It isn't great for them to collide at any speed, though. So again, it's not a long-term solution. These are some longer-term solutions. This is feather friendly. It is one of the most popular products on the market for reducing collisions. This is what's being used to treat the worst building in Ottawa, which is hopefully going to be losing its crown pretty soon. It basically, for the DIY version, goes on like a piece of Scotch tape. Then you rub it with a little squeegee, and then you peel the tape off, leaving behind the dots. For larger areas, they have a sort of middle version where there's 6 rows on one piece of tape, and then they have a commercial version, which is basically like a large piece of film that would be commercially installed. That's not the only method, though. We see a lot of window films that are used. This one in the upper right there, if you've been to Cafe at UBC, that's where that is. That's a custom designed window film there. Whereas down below on the bottom left, I think that is it's either a zoo or I think it's actually maybe a Wild Birds Unlimited. And so they have those basically a bus film so they can see out, but birds are prevented from seeing the glass from the outside. So lots of options there. Having screens on the exterior is really helpful. They do break up the reflections. The birds can see that there's something there. And then these are also something that on the right there that I have installed at my parents' place in Sydney. And it's essentially 2 little plastic staffs at the top and bottom with some string in between them. And these are super effective. And I think it cost me about $10 to treat a French door. So very cheap to do as well. You can get creative. They sell oil-based paint markers. And so these don't come off in the rain, at least not in the short term. I have seen ones that are amazingly decorative. I have also used them to just make dots. So you can really go as crazy as you want. artistic as you want with these, but as long as you have the right spacing, it doesn't matter what you put up, they'll still work. In terms of bigger projects, we tend to see these similar methods on a larger scale. You can see at the bottom left there, that's that one at the National Gallery that I mentioned. You can see that they have those little raptor stickers that were not effective and are treating it with the dots there. You can use that string, the paracord, at a wider scale at the upper right there, and then that bus wrap in the bottom right. If you do need new windows, especially for bigger projects, bird safe glass is the most permanent way to prevent collisions. Something that doesn't work is any sort of widely spaced decal, including the birds of prey silhouettes. Birds are too smart to think that that is an actual threat to them, or at least threat in terms of a predator. They don't recognize that it's a threat in terms of glass. And so they probably won't hit exactly where these decals are, but they'll certainly hit around them. One thing that we don't recommend, it's still sort of a field of study, is UV treatments. And these are sold as saying, oh, birds can see in UV, so you can't see it, but they can. We don't actually really know how well they can see it. There are some issues with it, mainly that not all species see UV. Also that a lot of collisions happen in the early morning when there's just not a lot of UV light present to reflect. And as well, most of the packages says in very small writing, these need to be replaced every 9 months or so, or every year or so. And no one ever does that. So we really don't recommend these UV products. It would be great to have ones that work, and we are seeing a lot of research and development there. But at the moment, these products are not ones we recommend. All right, so I'll move in just a quick rundown of what SafeWings does. SafeWings was started in 2014, as I mentioned, as a result of a large flock colliding at Ottawa City Hall. We do building monitoring, so we identify these problem buildings. We collect data and we do rescue injured birds when we find them. That data collection has gone to a number of places, talking to the buildings, doing outreach with them, but also reporting them under the Migratory Bird Convention Act. So work in progress there. We do work with government, so the City of Ottawa to develop the bird-friendly design guidelines, the National Capital Commission, which is the federal entity and landowner in Ottawa-Gatineau region, as well as the federal government. And we are seeing lots of buildings getting treated as a result of this. We do quite a bit of outreach. We worked with the city on the Ottawa Bird Strategy with a number of other partners. We talked to property owners, managers, architects, builders, you name it, we talked to them, from the public up to decision makers in upper levels of government and business. And we have quite a large social media presence as well. SafeWings does have a hotline that we run sort of in combination with the Wild Bird Care Center, which is one of the rehab centers in Ottawa, where they offer the hotline during the day, and then we cover the hours before and after they close. So we provide some assistance when we can, but mainly we provide advice and knowledge. We do have some rehabilitators who focus on specifically window collisions, although they help with other things as well. But we've had a huge increase in the survival rate with things like oxygen therapy, anti-inflammatories, and then we partner with the Wild Bird Care Center for longer-term injuries. So does Victoria have something similar? Well, there have been some building monitoring studies at UVic. There's been a little bit of work with government. The Victoria's Bird Strike Initiative was something that was run for a few years. It's since gone dormant, mainly because everyone who was working on it moved away. Maybe not as much outreach and education as there could be. There is some support in terms of birds that have collided from the SPCA and WildArk, but I will note that last time I checked, the SPCA was still selling window alerts, and I have talked to them about that, but they still do it. So I'll just finish up with how you can help birds. You can treat your own windows, your own railings. Safe Wings has a great website that gives lots of examples of how to do this. You can rescue live birds. It's very important to act quickly because often the birds will fly away, and that doesn't mean that they're okay. WildArk does have a phone number that you can call. They usually will call you back, and they have several places where you can bring the birds. But it's important to keep them somewhere quiet, dark, and to get them to a rehabber if possible, and then work to address preventing them or preventing birds from hitting in the future. And this brings me to something, this is another very common myth with collisions. You get a lot of people saying, it seems fine now, can I let it go? And the answer to this is always no. The most part, injuries can take time to appear. This pine grosbeak in the bottom right, it looked fine the day of the collision. It developed bleeding in the eye the next day and could not see. So if it had just been let fly away, it definitely would have died. We also tend to see in a couple different species, but any species can have this happen, is sometimes birds will get these very small tears in their air sacs, and a little bit of air will escape between their body mass on the inside and their skin with every breath, and they essentially inflate like balloons and have to be deflated. And we usually see this happening on the second day after a collision. And unless they are treated, they essentially become like balloons to the point where they can't move very well. So we see this happening in creepers a lot, but it recently happened in a downy woodpecker. And then birds that are being cared for at rehabilitators, they are provided with food in a safe environment. And this is something that, you know, just as much as their injuries can kill them, is if they are exposed to a lack of food or they're just vulnerable to predators because they're not quite with it. So this is a big take-home message. Other things you can do is advocate for birds at your building, you know, monitor for collisions. There's this global bird mapper, and you can report collisions there. And it's really great for showing that there is an issue and keeping track of data. This condo in the upper right here, notice that those little railings in between units, they had glass railing panels and they were having a lot of collisions. And a couple people approached their condo board and said, hey, here's the solution to this problem. Can we do it? And they ended up doing it. And so we were very happy to see that. So it is definitely possible to speak out and get a good result. It's important to share your knowledge. This is something that, you know, I'm sure if you're like me and people know that you work with birds, people will always ask you about something related to birds. And often it has to do with collisions. And so you can share your knowledge. You can advocate for bird-friendly building design by contacting officials in your municipality or province at the federal level. You can attend consultations when there's new buildings proposed, and talk to the architects and the builders and saying, okay, that's a nice design, but how is it going to be safe for birds? And push for more conservation action. This is something I found in BC. There's a lot of great conservation organizations, and they do a lot of very important work, but there hasn't really been a lot of push in the nonprofit sector for collisions. So there's definitely a big need for research, advocacy, and education. And collisions are such a solvable issue, you know, and this is something that I've found very rewarding, is although it is frustrating sometimes, I am seeing the worst building in Ottawa getting treated, and it feels like it's taken ages, but it's been less than a decade of work, and we have saved already thousands of birds through our direct action, and that is a very powerful feeling. So I'll just end there. I hope we have a little bit of time for questions right now. If you don't have a chance to ask, you can contact me, willow@safewings.ca. Take a look at the SafeWings website. As I said, there's lots of examples of ways to treat your own buildings, and there's a lot of resources as well if you want to talk to building owners. So with that, I don't know, Anne, if we have time for a question or two, but if we do, I'm happy to answer them.
We are happy to ask questions as long as you're happy to stay awake.
I will do my best.
We so much appreciate you doing this so late at night. That was a fantastic presentation and a lot of great information. And I know that there will be some questions. There's a couple of comments in the chat, so I'm just going to mention them right now. Yeah, Kevin suggests that we look at the state of Canada's birds report that just came out this week. But also, if you have a business that is not putting in their bird-friendly glass, give them some one-star reviews and bring attention to it. And that usually gets the company's attention. So if you have a question, you can put it in the chat or you can unmute and ask directly.
Yes, thank you for bringing attention to the state of Canada's birds. I will say it's an amazing project and fantastic. And I probably should say that I was one of the main people working on it. So
Nice.
definitely a bias there.
I actually am hoping to get a speaker from that project to do one of the Birders' Nights presentations in the new year.
Oh, well, yeah, let me know. And then, I mean, we share
You'd have to
knowledge.
stay up late again.
Well, yeah, I guess I could do it that one too. I don't know if people are tired of listening to me, but
Okay.
yeah, no,
Any
definitely that
I
has
do
been a
have some.
great way to have people showing really what's happening with Canada's birds, both as a group level, and then I think the new website has been really great at allowing people to see what's happening at a species level and a regional level as well. And the next edition is going to have more of a regional focus. So being able to see what's happening in the Pacific Coast, what's happening in the Boreal, you know, all of that. So definitely there, stay tuned for round, I think it's 4 at this point, but yeah, we're excited to keep going with that.
Okay, and I actually do have people here and a question.
Oh, hi.
Did you catch that, Willow?
I can't hear anything, no.
Okay, the question was, what was the worst building in Ottawa for these collisions?
So the worst building in Ottawa that we are aware of was 200 Kent Street, and it essentially was shaped, well, it still is, shaped like a plus sign. And in each of the sort of indents in the corner, there's trees. And it's highly reflective. And so these trees were surrounded with reflective glass on 2 sides. And across the street from it is a church with very large mature trees. And so on a bad day, you could just walk around that building and find a new bird with every loop. It has about a quarter of it has been treated now, and we are very excited about that. It is not perfect. It's still a menace on the other sides, but they did listen to us in terms of which side was the priority. So the one facing the church with the trees is the one that they've treated. I will say that there is at least one other building that is really bad, but we don't know how bad because it is the building that houses Canada's spy organization, and they do not let us patrol there. So they have actually had their own staff members document collisions, but there's a lot of rules. They're not allowed to tell us, you know, who found this bird, because then that would admit that that person worked there. It's all very hush hush. They have started a bit of treatment as well. It is very, very challenging to work with them though, because everything is a secret.
Okay, the person who asked the question worked at the Kent Street building for 10 years. So
Oh,
perhaps is not surprised to hear that.
yes. Well, it is being treated. If you look on Feather Friendly social media, you'll see, and Safe Wings, you'll see some pictures, and it's already very noticeable. We haven't had any birds in the treated areas. Soon I think they are planning on doing some more, but at the moment it's a bit weather limited because you can't, there's a bit of a loss of adhesion below, I think, 10 degrees, and Ottawa is getting chilly. So hoping to see more in the spring.
Ken Walker and Robert Thompson have both kind of asked similar questions, different perspective. Robert is a Central Saanich councillor and has asked if anyone's contacted the CRD locally or on other municipalities, and Ken's asked about TELUS Ocean building. When the TELUS Ocean was proposed, there was a lot of public outcry about its bird unfriendliness. And Willow, you did say in your talk here that they have agreed to use some bird friendly products. You sound like you're optimistic that as long as they follow through with this will be a good thing. Do you want to speak a little bit more about it?
Yeah, definitely. So the original design was pretty lethal looking. Then they said, as a result of some of this public outcry, which, I wrote a couple letters to the editor. I contacted, I had a friend who works at CBC in Victoria and got some media, got some people writing in. Then they said they were going to use UV glass. And while that can help, the study at the Pacific Wildlife Research Center near Rifle and in Delta found that it wasn't nearly as effective as visible markers. And so I had a few meetings with them. They were actually really open to ideas and changing some things. And they decided on going with this ceramic frit. So it's a visible marker. And we talked a lot about colors and spacing and all of that. I haven't heard from them in a bit, but I'm hoping that as long as they do what they said they were going to do, it should be okay in terms of bird-friendly building design. But in terms of, yes, we have talked to the CRD. We did reach out to every single municipality in Victoria. We did it again after the last municipal election. Victoria and Sydney, we had some movement. I think Esquimalt and View Royal had some interest. Most of the rest of the ones never replied.
Yes, I find it kind of interesting that Saanich has been declared a bird-friendly community and has probably done very little to address some of the concerns. I know they don't want to talk about cats, and I'm not sure what they're doing about windows, but I think that can be amped up a little bit. I can tell you that Rocky Point Bird Observatory is planning on doing some education in this regard too, and reaching out to groups like architects and builders. In 2025, we've got a plan in place to do some specific outreach to try and improve people's awareness around what they can do to conserve birds one building at a time. And so I'm happy about that. And we also are participating in an event on Sunday at Outerbridge Park. It will run from about 9 in the morning till 1 or 2 in the afternoon with a variety of events, including how to treat windows, much as you have described here. And originally, this was suggested as a talk for me, but I went there yesterday and put some feather-friendly dots on one of their worst windows. And I have decided that the rest of the treatments are going to actually be installed with them there on Sunday. I'm going to get kids participating in the painting of the windows and adults involved with making bird savers and other things like that. So we're going to give some real hands-on experience. So I hope anyone who's available can come by Outerbridge on Sunday, this Sunday coming up, the 27th.
I was there
27th.
today and it was still closed.
We'll have the other parking area open if that one is not, but it's supposed to be open. they also are thinking that there's going to be a lot more people than just for that parking lot. So they're suggesting that people park at Lockside if they can. So there are some things positive. The awareness is increasing, and I like Robert's idea of regional design standards, and I like the idea of standards as opposed to guidelines for the whole CRD. That would be awesome. Robert, if we can engage you in helping with this, I would love that.
Yeah, that would certainly be great, and it's wonderful to hear that there's so much happening. I know with Saanich, a lot of that bird-friendly city was led by the Swan Lake Nature Sanctuary. They have treated some of their windows. I've been pushing them to do more, but they do have some examples on, they've did sort of an area of windows with different methods of treating them. So if you're looking to see what might look okay on your windows, they're a good place to look. And I also know, oh, what is that park? Francis King, the nature center there. I talked to one of the park staff, and they did some great murals on the windows there. So we're seeing more and more, but it, really it needs to start with the nature places, the nature sanctuaries where
Yes.
people go to learn about it. So is a really good place to start. I'm going to be reaching out. I keep meaning to do this. The aquarium in Sydney, I think would be a good one. They have a lot of stuff about conservation, so it'd be great to have a bit on above the water conservation as well. But definitely it's
Dawn?
wonderful. There's definitely more happening on the West Coast and everywhere really. And it's super exciting to see it. But definitely it's something that you can really like. For me, I feel like I work with Arctic breeding shorebirds, and a lot of what they're facing is climate change, and it feels like I'm very powerless to stop it. But I feel like I can treat a window, and I can write a letter and eventually get some really bad buildings treated, and that we know saves thousands of birds. So it really is fulfilling.
Dawn, you have a question?
Well, yes, that was very inspiring talk and really gave a great overview. But some of the articles that I've read on experimental studies on sort of the window improvement and so on, glass and birds, have implied that there's not that much data on it. And so I was wondering if you get pushback from some of the architects saying, how good are the data actually to support this? Because obviously if you treat one building, you've got a before and after with a sample size of one, and it can be quite a problem. And sometimes after treatment, people don't find many birds, but don't necessarily keep the same level of data. And I had been told that much of the early work on the sort of window effect was done like in wind tunnels, where birds were sort of forced to fly through a tunnel rather than actually in a real building situation. And so many of the things you've said make sense, but I just wonder, is there a challenge in the data, or is it getting really clear now, the sort of the patterns that you talked about in other ones?
That is, yeah, a great question. I would say that a lack of published studies is something that has been a challenge, and that has largely, I think, been because much of the work of this has been done by nonprofit organizations, and they really lack the capacity and the resources to run scientific studies and to get them published. I know with Safe Wings, I'm actually one of the few people with a scientific background who are part of the organization. A lot of the other people are more just people who love birds. And so it's very hard to get, volunteers to go out when they feel like they're not doing anything. And so having controlled studies or doing post-treatment studies can be very hard, because someone's like, well, I've walked around that building now, it's been treated 50 times and I've never found a thing. Do I really have to keep going? Or they just stop. And so that's been an issue. And then you talk about, publishing costs can be thousands of dollars for a journal article. And I know Safe Wings runs on a few $1,000s a year. So that's a big barrier as well. We are seeing more and more research. I am on the sort of committee of a student and soon to be a postdoc who are working on collisions here at Carleton. There is more research happening at Simon Fraser. And so these are really exciting to see. And a lot of these studies are being done in conjunction both with universities and the federal government. So there's definitely more attention. It is hard to test. As you mentioned, one of the ways that they test the effectiveness of some solutions is through this tunnel test, where they essentially have two exits, and one will have the treatment and one doesn't, and they'll see which one they fly towards. But you're dealing with birds that have just been extracted from a mist net and are a bit stressed, and they're in a dark area looking out at a light area. And so there's a number of reasons why some people are now pushing back against that method. Some of the other methods that have been used is essentially putting glass windows in the middle of forests and seeing how many birds hit. There's some ethical issues with that, even if the numbers are very small compared to the number that are colliding every day. But finding a good way to test has been a challenge, but it is one that is being increasingly addressed. And I think we're really starting to see a surge in these. But it is hard, because when we look or we get asked to do assessments, and we say, okay, that one's going to be more dangerous than that one, and that window, and we know this from our experience and finding thousands of dead birds. But anyone who's spending money wants harder evidence than that. So definitely it's been a challenge, but one that we're starting to address.
Yeah. Oh, well, that's very interesting. I had something to do with the editing of those recent studies out of the University of Utah. And so that was sort of committed researchers with a lot of scientific background and a huge amount of effort, but it was still a big challenge to get strong data to support the effect of changes, even though they realized that. So I'm glad you gave that additional overview. I think that that really helps, and it also helps identify the gaps where other people might be inspired to kind of try to fill in if they're in a situation where they're actually seeing a change.
Yeah, well, thank you for bringing it up. I think it is important because people like numbers, and like I think that PWRC, the Pacific Wildlife Research Center, they showed 95% effectiveness when putting up feather friendly, which has been cited so many times, not just by other publications, but just by people saying, please install this, it works, and here's evidence. So it's been
Yeah.
really valuable having, and that's just one study. So, and it was like one building.
Right, exactly. Which window do they do and all like that. So yes. Okay, thanks. And thanks again for the talk and your commitment to this topic. It's so important, and you've given a great overview.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you again, Willow. It's awesome having you, and we'll talk about the state of Canada's birds as well. If you want to go to bed now, you can do that. And I just have a few announcements, and I'll also ask if anybody else has any. You're also welcome to stay if you want to. So anybody,
Good.
thank you again.
Good night, and thank you everyone for attending, and I will maybe talk to you in the future about the state of Canada's birds.
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night.
I need to unshare.
I can stop you if you like.
Yes, please do.
Okay, there you go.
All
You're
right.
stopped.
Good night.
Good night, Willow. Okay, so obviously I have announcements about the Christmas bird count. That's counts. I should say that is coming up. So if you haven't already put them on your calendar, please do. December 14th for Victoria, December 15th for Sydney and Salt Spring Island, December 27th for Souk, and December 29th now is confirmed for Duncan. So get your calendars all marked up, because those are coming along. We are having a little bit of trouble with the generic email addresses. There's been some changes in the ownership of different aspects of the VNHS internet stuff. So we'll be sending out an email out to everyone, but the generic addresses may not work. So if you've been sending something to your CBC1 or CBC10 at naturevictoria.ca, at the moment, those are not working, but we're trying to get that fixed. And we're always looking for new people to be on the count. So if you're interested, please reach out. Does anybody else have any announcements? Kevin?
I just want to make members aware that the Nature Victoria field trips, we're going to return to Rifle Migratory Bird Sanctuary. So this field trip is coming up on November 9th. Today I've updated the calendar to include a sign-up form. We're going to carpool to Rifle, and the idea is to put some people together, kind of arrange this carpooling